Hey you, and welcome to the deep dive. We're genuinely excited to explore something really crucial for your English journey today.
It's always great to be here. Yeah, digging into what really helps learners make progress.
So we all know that feeling, don't we? You can understand English pretty well. You watch movies, follow conversations, maybe even read like complex articles.
The comprehension is there.
Exactly. But then when it's your turn to speak, it feels like, well, like your tongue just ties itself in knots. The words just don't seem to flow the way you want them to.
Yeah, that gap, the gap between understanding and actually speaking fluently, it can be incredibly frustrating, can't it?
It really can. So have you personally experienced that maybe when learning another language?
Oh, absolutely. It's a very, very common hurdle. I mean, anyone learning a new language goes through this. Your brain gets really good at, receiving and processing the English input.
Right, decoding it.
Precisely, but actively producing it. That uses a different set of mental muscles, a different kind of pathway in the brain.
Exactly. So today we're digging deep into a set of really practical ideas, strategies that aim to bridge that exact gap. Think of this as like your personal toolkit for unlocking your speaking potential.
Unlocking what's often already there just needs activation.
Yes. Our mission in this deep dive is to pull out the most effective tips, those real aha moments from the material we've looked at, strategies that you can actually use starting today to speak English with the same kind of confidence you have when you're just listening or reading.
We're essentially looking at how to activate that English knowledge that's, often sitting there kind of dormant, waiting to be used properly in conversation.
Precisely. And hey, before we really dive in, if you find this deep dive helpful, and we really think you will, and you want more insights like this to genuinely boost your English skills, please make sure you hit that subscribe button for the channel. It really helps us out.
Definitely. Okay, so where do we start?
All right, let's get started. Our sources today, they really highlight 5 key approaches, 5 main solutions to tackle this challenge of understanding English well, but, struggling to speak it fluently. The very first one focuses on something called the equal ratio.
Ah, yes, the equal ratio.
What's the core idea behind this one? It sounds mathematical.
Well, it kind of is, but in a simple way. The equal ratio really shines a light on a potential imbalance, a common one, in how you might be spending your learning time.
An imbalance? How so?
Well, think about it. Many learners, quite naturally, gravitate towards consuming English content. Watching videos, listening to podcasts like this one perhaps, reading books or articles.
Right, lots of input, which feels productive.
And it is. These activities are fantastic for building comprehension because they heavily engage your eyes and ears, the, let's say, passive receptors of language.
Okay, so you're absorbing all that input, which is absolutely essential for building your understanding, your vocabulary base, getting a feel for the grammar.
Exactly. Your brain becomes very efficient at decoding English, at understanding what's being said or written. However, and this is the crucial part, speaking is different.
It's active, not passive.
Precisely. It's an active skill. It requires you to generate language, to actively use your vocal cords, your mouth, your tongue. It's all about output, production.
Right?
So if most of your time is spent purely on passive activities, like just listening or watching, you're simply not giving your speaking abilities the workout they desperately need to develop.
That's a really great analogy you used earlier, like learning a sport.
Exactly. You can watch basketball games 24/7. You can analyze every single play, understand all the rules.
Know all the stats.
Know all the stats, become a walking encyclopedia of basketball. But you won't actually get any better at playing basketball, at shooting hoops or dribbling, until you physically get on the court and start practicing those specific skills yourself.
That makes perfect sense. So we might be really, really good at the intake of English, the comprehension side, but seriously lagging behind on the output side, the actual speaking part.
Precisely. And the equal ratio is proposed as a direct response to fix this imbalance. It suggests, quite simply, that you should aim to dedicate roughly the same amount of time to actively speaking English as you spend listening to or watching English content.
Wow, okay, the same amount of time.
Roughly, yes.
Yeah.
It's about consciously creating a deliberate balance between your consumption and your production. The goal is to ensure that those neural pathways associated with language production are also being consistently strengthened, not just the comprehension ones.
Okay, so it's about evening the scales, balancing the books, so to speak. If I spend, let's say, half an hour watching an English lesson on YouTube, the equal ratio principle suggests I should then find a way to dedicate around half an hour right after to actively speaking English myself.
That's the core idea, yes. A direct, ideally minute-for-minute commitment to actively engaging with the language you've just encountered or learned about. It's about immediately trying to put what you've heard or watched into practice.
Okay, that sounds demanding. But I see the logic. So after I've watched something, say that 30-minute lesson, what should I actually do with that 30 minutes of speaking time? Should I just talk about my cat in English or?
Well, you talk about your cat. But the source material actually offers a really helpful structured breakdown of how to use that speaking time most effectively, tying it back to the content you just consumed.
Okay, structure is good. What does it suggest?
It suggests dividing your dedicated speaking time into 2 equal parts. So for your 30-minute example, that's 2 15-minute blocks.
Right, 15 and 15.
The first 15 minutes in this case, should be focused entirely on summarizing the content you just watched or listened to.
Okay. So if I watch that 30-minute video explaining maybe different ways to use phrasal verbs.
Yeah, classic tricky one.
Then for the first 15 minutes of my speaking time, I should try my best to recall and summarize the main rules, the examples they gave, maybe the key verbs discussed, all in my own English words, out loud.
Exactly. This forces you to actively retrieve the information. You have to pull out the vocabulary, remember the grammatical structures that were presented. You're not just passively nodding along thinking, yeah, I get it.
All right, you're proving you get it by actually articulating it.
Precisely. You're actively reconstructing and verbalizing the key concepts. This active recall process is known to be a much, much more powerful way to solidify learning in your long-term memory compared to just passive review.
Okay, I see. It's about really wrestling with the material, actively engaging with it instead of just letting it kind of wash over me. Makes sense. And what about the second half of that speaking time? The other 15 minutes?
The remaining half, the second 15 minutes, should then be dedicated to expressing your personal opinions, your thoughts, your reactions to the content.
Ooh, okay. That sounds more creative.
It is. This is where you move beyond simply regurgitating the information you just summarized, and you start to make it your own. You're connecting it to your own understanding, your own experiences, your own perspective.
So, going back to my phrasal verbs video example. After spending 15 minutes summarizing the rules and the main verbs covered, I would then spend the next 15 minutes sharing my own thoughts about those phrasal verbs. Like, maybe I could talk about which ones I find particularly confusing, or if I can think of examples from my own life where I might use look up or give up, or maybe even discuss whether I found the video's explanation clear or perhaps a bit muddled.
Precisely. That's exactly the idea. This part encourages you to personalize the new information. You connect it to your existing knowledge, your feelings, your experiences. This not only deepens your actual understanding of the material itself, but it also provides incredibly valuable practice in expressing your own thoughts and feelings in English, which is, a core part of real conversational fluency.
That's a really practical, actionable way to break it down. Summarize first, then react personally. The source material, I remember, it even gave a specific example with timing, something like watching a 15-minute video.
Yes, that's right. If you watch, say, a 15-minute video lesson, maybe it's about storytelling techniques or a new software tool, whatever, you'd immediately follow that with 7.5 minutes dedicated to summarizing the key takeaways.
So the main points, any specific stories or examples they use, the core message.
Exactly. You'd verbalize all that, and then you'd spend another 7.5 minutes sharing your personal reflections on that content. Did you agree with the points made? Did anything surprise you? How does it relate to something you already know or have experienced yourself?
Okay, 7.5 and 7.5 for a 15-minute input. It scales nicely. It really is about processing the information on multiple levels, isn't it?
It really is. First, you ensure you understand it passively. Then you actively recall and rephrase it, which demonstrates your comprehension much more effectively. And finally, you engage with it critically and personally, using the target language English to express your own unique perspective. Each of these stages is crucial for building true, flexible fluency.
It definitely sounds like it could be quite challenging at first, though. I mean, really spending the same amount of time speaking as you just spent listening or watching, that might feel like a huge amount of pressure, especially if you're not used to speaking that much in English, or maybe you feel self-conscious.
Oh, absolutely. The source material is very clear in acknowledging that initial feeling of challenge. It's definitely a significant shift in learning habits for many, many people.
It requires real discipline.
It does. And like any new habit, whether it's going to the gym or learning an instrument, it will require conscious effort and consistent application, especially in the beginning. You might feel awkward. You might run out of things to say initially.
Yeah, the silence could feel long.
It could. But the potential payoff, the benefit in terms of your improved speaking ability is genuinely substantial. By actively practicing speaking for an equal duration, you are essentially training your brain and your mouth, your articulators, to work together smoothly in English.
Building those connections.
Exactly. You're building and strengthening those neural pathways that make speaking feel more automatic, more natural over time. And that's what ultimately helps bridge that frustrating gap between understanding and fluent expression. Consistency is key.
Okay, the equal ratio. It makes a lot of sense as a fundamental principle for balancing our learning activities, a solid foundation. Let's move on to the second solution highlighted in our sources. This one is learn and use one new word. Now, this sounds deceptively simple on the surface, doesn't it? But I imagine there's probably more to it than just, trying to memorize a random dictionary word every day.
Yes, definitely more nuance than that. The source material really highlights a very common situation that many learners find themselves in. You encounter new vocabulary and expressions all the time, right? Through your English studies, maybe watching movies, listening to music, interacting online.
Sure, you pick things up passively.
Exactly. You might hear a new word in a podcast, see an interesting phrase used in a movie subtitle, and you might even understand its meaning perfectly from the context. You think, okay, I know what that means now.
Right, you recognize it.
But the crucial step that often gets overlooked, the step that makes the real difference for speaking, is actively incorporating that new piece of language into your own spoken English, making it part of your active, usable toolkit.
Right. It's like having a shiny new tool delivered to your workshop, maybe a fancy new screwdriver. You know what it is, you know what it's for, but you haven't actually picked it up and practiced using it to screw something in yet.
That's a perfect analogy. You know it's there sitting in the toolbox, but when you actually need to use a screwdriver in a real situation, you might hesitate, you might not be quite sure how to hold it correctly, or you might even forget you have it and reach for an old familiar tool instead.
Yeah, you revert to what's comfortable, even if it's less effective.
Exactly. Passive recognition is a necessary starting point, of course, but it's simply not the same thing as active recall and confident usage in spontaneous conversation.
So what's the solution proposed here? It's not about overwhelming ourselves, is it?
No, definitely not. The solution presented isn't about trying to cram, 50 new words into your brain every single week by rote memorization from lists. That approach often feels overwhelming. It's hard to sustain, and it usually leads to inconsistency and frustration.
Yeah, you might do it for a week and then just give up because it's too much.
Precisely. Instead, the focus here is on a much more manageable, much more sustainable, and ultimately more effective approach. Learn and, crucially, use at least just one new word, or maybe a new expression or idiom, or even a new grammatical concept you've learned every single day.
Just one a day. Okay, now that sounds far less daunting. It feels much more achievable than trying to tackle huge vocabulary lists only sporadically, like maybe cramming before a test.
Exactly. The emphasis here is squarely on consistency over sheer quantity. Quality over quantity, in a sense. Even learning and using seemingly simple words or common phrases can be incredibly beneficial if you actively integrate them into your daily speech patterns.
So it's about building a habit.
Yes. The main goal is to cultivate the habit of not just encountering new vocabulary, but actively making it a part of your productive language skills, something you can readily access and use confidently when you need it in a conversation or when expressing yourself.
So it's about that transformation, isn't it? Transforming that new word from something you just passively recognize when you hear or read it into something you can actively produce and use correctly when you're speaking.
That's the core transformation we're aiming for.
And the source material, helpfully, provides a very clear step-by-step method for actually making this happen on a daily basis. What are the key steps involved in this one word a day practice?
Okay, so the first crucial step is to actively identify and physically write down at least one new word, expression, or concept that you've encountered during your English learning or exposure that day.
So be intentional about noticing things.
Yes. This new item could come from a video you watched, a lesson you took, maybe a conversation you overheard or participated in, or even just something you read in an article or a book. The simple physical act of writing it down helps to engage your memory and makes the word feel more concrete, more real.
Okay, so step one, Spot something new, decide this is my word phrase for today, and jot it down somewhere, notebook, phone, app, whatever works.
Right.
What comes next?
The second vital step is to consciously find a way to apply that new word or expression to something that is actually happening in your own day, your own life, your own thoughts.
Make it personal.
Exactly. This is about creating a personal connection to the new vocabulary item. Making it relevant to your immediate world makes it significantly more memorable and meaningful. It moves it beyond just being an abstract piece of linguistic information.
That makes total sense. Instead of just learning a random word like serendipity in isolation, I should actively look for an opportunity to link it to my own experiences or my current reality. Like, maybe I unexpectedly bumped into an old friend today. That was serendipitous.
Perfect example. That personal link makes it much more likely to stick in your mind.
Yeah.
And the final step in this daily process was the most critical part. The final and arguably the most important step is to actually use that new word or expression in a spoken sentence. You need to say it out loud.
Out loud. Okay.
This could be in a real conversation you have with someone else, maybe a language exchange partner, a colleague, a friend, or if you don't have an immediate opportunity for that, simply by speaking aloud to yourself.
Talking to yourself is okay.
Absolutely. The key is the act of production, the vocalization. This is the step that truly transfers the word from your passive understanding bucket into your active speaking vocabulary bucket.
Right. Getting it out of your head and into the world through your mouth. The source provides a really clear example using a slightly unusual word, gargantuan. Can you walk us through how that illustrates this three-step method in action?
Certainly. The example starts, as it should, by providing a simple, understandable definition of gargantuan, basically meaning extremely large or really, really big.
Okay, got it. Big.
Then, step 2, it shows how to connect it to a real-world scenario. Perhaps you were watching a nature documentary on TV earlier that day, and it featured blue whales, which are undeniably enormous creatures.
Right, easy connection there. Whales, he's big.
Exactly. Then comes step 3, the crucial usage part. It demonstrates how to actively use the word in a sentence related directly to that scenario. You would actually say aloud, maybe to yourself in the room, "Wow, the whale in that video was really big. In fact, you could say it was a gargantuan whale."
And the source really stresses the importance of physically saying this sentence out loud, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That emphasis on saying it out loud is critical. It's not enough to just think about how you might use the word in a sentence. You actually have to physically produce the sounds, form the sentence with your mouth, get your tongue and lips involved.
Engaging the physical aspect of speech.
Precisely. It's about getting your articulators, your mouth, tongue, lips, vocal cords, accustomed to forming the new sounds and integrating that specific word into your spoken English patterns. Even if you're just talking to yourself, you're still getting that invaluable practice of articulation and usage.
So it's like muscle memory for your mouth.
In a way, yes. And this consistent daily effort, identifying one thing, connecting it personally, and saying it aloud, even with just one new word or phrase each day, can lead to really significant vocabulary expansion and a noticeable increase in your speaking confidence over time. It's the power of compounding, applying small, consistent efforts daily.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we've got the equal ratio for creating that fundamental balance between listening and speaking, and now the learn and use one new word method for actively and consistently growing our usable vocabulary. Let's move to the third solution. This one shifts our focus a bit, looking at how we process our everyday experiences. It's called Summarize Your Day. What's the underlying problem that this particular technique is trying to address?
Well, the source material points out a very common and completely understandable tendency among language learners. We tend to primarily think about our daily lives, our routines, the interactions we have, the things that happen to us in our native language.
Of course, that's our default setting.
It's completely natural. Our native language is the one we have the deepest, most automatic, most effortless connection to. However, when it comes to improving our ability to speak English fluently, this ingrained habit of thinking predominantly in our native tongue can actually create a significant bottleneck.
A bottleneck? How so?
Because you might find yourself constantly having to mentally translate your thoughts from your native language into English in real time, right as you're trying to speak. You think the thought in language A, then you have to search for the equivalent words or structures in English, language B, and then try to say it.
Oh, wow. That sounds incredibly mentally taxing. Having that internal translation process running constantly in the background must really slow you down and make speaking feel like incredibly hard work, rather than a smooth flow.
It absolutely can be exhausting.
Yeah.
It not only consumes a lot of mental energy and processing power, but it also significantly hinders your fluency. It makes your speech sound hesitant and choppy. Plus, it can make it more difficult to access the English vocabulary and grammatical structures that you actually already know because your brain is so busy translating.
So you get stuck in translation mode instead of just thinking in English.
Exactly. And the Summarize Your Day technique is specifically designed to help you start shifting that process. The goal is to encourage you to actively begin thinking about and processing your daily events directly in the English language, bypassing the translation step as much as possible.
So it's about deliberately training our brains to operate in English more frequently, even when we're just reflecting internally on what happened to us during the day.
That's interesting. How does this technique actually work in practice? What are the steps involved?
The core idea is pretty straightforward. At the end of each day, you consciously take some time, maybe just 10 or 15 minutes, to summarize 3 to 5 of the main activities or significant events that happened to you during that day.
Okay, just the highlights.
Just the main things. But the crucial element here, the non-negotiable part, is that you do this summary entirely in English, both in your thoughts and ideally by speaking it out loud.
Out loud again. So even if my English feels a bit, clunky, or I struggle to find the perfect words, or my grammar isn't spot on, I should still try my best to articulate those events in English. Absolutely, yes. The primary goal at this stage isn't necessarily achieving perfect grammatical accuracy or using incredibly sophisticated vocabulary. It's about making the active, conscious effort to convert your thoughts, your memories, your experiences into English words and sentences.
Forcing the connection.
You're essentially forcing your brain to process the day's happenings through the framework, through the lens of the English language. And this repeated practice, day after day, strengthens the direct connection between your personal experiences and your ability to express them in English.
Okay, I can see how that would help build more direct pathways. The source also provides some concrete steps to help people implement this summarize your day technique consistently. What does that practical application look like on a daily basis?
Right, making it practical is key. The first step recommended is to set aside a specific time each day for this practice. Perhaps 15 minutes right before you go to bed could work well, as the day is fresh in your mind.
Building it into the end-of-day routine.
Exactly. Consistency is really crucial here, as with the other techniques. Making it a regular, non-negotiable part of your daily schedule will yield the best long-term results.
Okay, so find 15 minutes at the end of the day for this specific English reflection task. What's the next step in the process once I've set aside the time?
The next step is to consciously think back over your day. Scan through the hours and identify maybe 3 to 5 main things that stood out to you. What were the most memorable events, the most significant activities, the key interactions?
So not every little detail, just the main headlines of my day.
Precisely. These could be anything, really, maybe a challenging conversation you had with a colleague, a difficult task you finally completed at work or home, something new or interesting you learned, a funny moment, or even just a significant feeling or emotion you experienced strongly during the day.
Just the key moments, the things that define my day. And then what do I actually do with these 3 to 5 highlights?
Then comes the most crucial part. You describe or explain these selected events out loud in English. This is where the active processing and the direct language production really happen. You're not just silently thinking about it in English in your head.
You're verbalizing it.
You're actually verbalizing it, forming sentences, choosing words, using your English vocabulary and grammar skills to recount your day, your experiences.
Okay. Speaking it makes it more real, more active. The source used a really interesting personal example, didn't it? Where the host speaker was talking to a friend about, I think it was married life.
That's right.
And then they realized they needed to consciously process and articulate that whole conversation later in Korean, which was the language they were learning at the time. How does that specific example relate to someone who is learning English?
The underlying principle is exactly the same, just swap the languages. Just as the host speaker needed to consciously take that real-life experience, the conversation about marriage, and actively process it, think about it, and then articulate it using Korean vocabulary and structures. As an English learner, you need to make that same conscious effort with your own daily experiences.
Yeah.
You might initially think about what happened, say you're meeting at work in your native language. That's natural. But then you actively push your brain, you force it to convert those thoughts into English words and actually speak them aloud. Today I had a meeting about the project. It was quite long. We discussed the budget and so on.
So it's about intentionally engaging with your own life, your own reality, through the lens of the English language. You're making that linguistic connection between your inner world, your daily happenings, and your ability to express it all in English.
Precisely. It's like building a direct pathway, a bridge, between your daily life and your English speaking ability by actively, repeatedly engaging with your experiences using the target language itself. It helps to make English feel less like a separate subject you study and more like a tool you use to describe your actual life.
That really clarifies it. It's about making English relevant to me. Okay, let's move on to the fourth solution that the sources highlight. This one is titled, Take Notes and Read Them. Now, taking notes during learning is generally considered a pretty standard, good study strategy, right? But the source suggests there's a potential pitfall here, something we need to be aware of. What is it that often goes wrong with note-taking?
You're right, taking notes is a positive habit. Many diligent English learners make a regular practice of taking notes during lessons, maybe while watching educational YouTube videos, or even when they encounter new information in conversations or reading. They might jot down new vocabulary words, important grammar rules they want to remember, or interesting phrases and idioms they come across.
Yeah, seems like a good way to capture information.
It is. It's a fantastic initial step. It helps to focus your attention during the learning process, and it creates a physical or digital record of what you're learning. However, the problem often arises after the notes have been taken.
Okay. What happens then?
What often happens is that these carefully written notes then simply sit there. They sit in a notebook on a shelf, they get stored away in a folder on a phone, or saved as a file on a computer, and they are never actually revisited or actively used for review and practice.
The classic scenario. Having really good intentions when taking the notes, meticulously writing everything down, but then not quite following through with the review part.
Exactly. The notes become this kind of passive collection, a graveyard of potentially useful information that never really gets activated or properly integrated into our working knowledge of the language.
The host speaker even shares a personal experience related to this, don't they, about learning Korean.
Yes, they mentioned taking copious, detailed notes while studying Korean, pages and pages of them, but then admitting that, unfortunately, those notes didn't always get reviewed as consistently or as actively as they perhaps should have been for maximum benefit. It's a very relatable experience for many learners.
Definitely relatable. I've got notebooks like that myself. So the initial effort of taking the notes is commendable, it shows engagement, but the crucial next step, the regular review and active engagement with that noted material, is often the missing piece of the puzzle.
It often is. And as we've already discussed quite a bit today, that active engagement, the active production of the language, is absolutely key to making significant, tangible progress in your speaking fluency. Just having the notes isn't enough.
So what specific solution does the source material propose to address this common issue of underutilized, forgotten notes?
The solution proposed is surprisingly simple, yet potentially incredibly effective if done consistently. Regularly review your English language notes by reading them out loud.
Out loud again. There's a real theme emerging here about vocalization.
There absolutely is. Reading your notes aloud transforms them. They go from being just a passive repository of stored information into an active tool for language practice and reinforcement.
How does reading them aloud help more than just reading them silently?
Well, the physical act of reading your own notes aloud does several things simultaneously. It helps to solidify the vocabulary you wrote down back into your memory. It reinforces the grammatical structures you noted. And, most importantly for our focus today on speaking, it directly facilitates real-life application by getting your mouth and tongue accustomed, once again, to physically producing the specific English words and phrases that you identified as important enough to learn.
Okay. So it's like a bridge between the passive learning act of writing the note and the active speaking act of using that language in conversation.
Exactly. It's another practical way to get that crucial physical act of speaking involved in your learning process. Even when you're just reviewing material you've already encountered and processed once before, it reactivates the learning.
So it's like a double dose of engagement with the material. The source also outlines a specific practical routine for implementing this note reading practice effectively. What are the recommended steps for making this happen regularly?
Okay, the routine has a few key parts. The first step, of course, is to continue that good habit of making a conscious effort to write short, focused notes throughout the week. Capture any new English language information you encounter that you genuinely want to remember.
So keep taking notes from videos, conversations, lessons, articles, anything that seems useful or interesting. Maybe a new idiom, a pronunciation tip, a correction someone gave me.
Exactly. Just quick reminders, key phrases that stood out, new vocabulary, maybe with a short definition or example sentence, whatever you feel is important to capture for later review. And then, what's the next crucial step in the routine?
Okay, so I have my notes accumulating through the week. What next?
The next step is to designate a specific day each week for reviewing these accumulated notes. Treat it like an appointment. Maybe it's Sunday evening or Friday afternoon, whatever fits your schedule. Having a set recurring time in your weekly plan helps to build consistency and makes it much more likely that you'll actually follow through and do it.
Okay, schedule a weekly notes review session. That sounds like a manageable and effective habit to establish. And the actual review process during that session involves reading these collected notes out loud. How many times does the source suggest reading them for the best effect?
The specific recommendation is to read your collected notes, everything you've jotted down that week out loud, a total of 3 times during your dedicated review session.
3 times, not just once. Is there a specific reason behind repeating it 3 times?
Yes. There's a clear rationale provided for the repetition. The source explains that the first time you read your notes aloud, especially if you haven't looked at them since you wrote them, it might feel a little awkward or unfamiliar. You might stumble over words.
Yeah, a cold read.
Exactly. The second time you read them through, you'll likely feel more comfortable. The words and phrases will start to flow a bit better, sound more natural coming out of your mouth.
Getting warmed up.
Precisely. And by the third time you read them aloud, your tongue, your mouth, your articulators will have become significantly more familiar with the specific sounds, the rhythm, the patterns of the English words and phrases on your page. This increased familiarity makes it easier for you to pronounce them correctly, and, importantly, makes it much easier for you to recall and use them more readily and accurately when you're speaking spontaneously in a real conversation later on.
That makes perfect sense. It's like a mini vocal workout, a rehearsal for the language you've been learning, using your own curated material. And the source also makes a really insightful point, doesn't it, about why reading your own notes is particularly effective.
Yes, it highlights that your personal notes are inherently interesting and relevant to you. Why? Because you are the one who actively listened or read, identified that specific piece of information as important or useful, and made the conscious decision to write it down in the first place.
So there's already a level of personal investment.
Exactly, because you actively engaged with the material enough to record it. You already have a stronger connection to it than to some random list of words. And furthermore, the physical act of writing itself is known to create a stronger connection in your brain to that information. So when you then revisit it and read it aloud, that recall and subsequent usage becomes easier and more effective. It's a really powerful way to reactivate your passive knowledge and bring it much closer to active, fluent use in your speaking.
Okay, this is really practical stuff. So just to recap where we are, we've covered the importance of balancing listening and speaking with the equal ratio. We've talked about actively building usable vocabulary through the learn and use one new word daily method. We've explored training ourselves to think more directly in English by regularly summarizing our day. And now we've seen how activating our learning by taking notes and then consistently reading them aloud can solidify that knowledge. This brings us to the 5th and final solution that the source highlights, which is reading out loud and shadowing. Now, this sounds somewhat similar to the previous point about reading notes aloud, but it seems to involve external material and has that interesting additional element of shadowing. What's the core idea behind this technique?
You're right, there's overlap, but also a key difference. While the previous technique focused specifically on reading your own curated notes aloud, this 5th technique, reading out loud and shadowing, involves actively engaging with existing English language content that someone else has produced. This could be videos, audio recordings like podcasts or audiobooks, or even written articles and book chapters.
Okay, so using external resources this time.
Exactly. And the source addresses that very common scenario where learners might passively watch English videos or read English materials, maybe primarily for relaxation, entertainment, or just general comprehension practice. While this kind of passive exposure is certainly valuable for improving your understanding and building vocabulary,
It's good for input.
it's great for input. But, as we keep saying, it's not always sufficient on its own for actively developing your speaking skills, your pronunciation, your fluency.
Right, that passive consumption is beneficial, but it doesn't necessarily give our speaking muscles, our pronunciation, that direct, focused workout they need to improve significantly.
Precisely. So reading out loud and shadowing aims to add that crucial active layer to your consumption of English content. Now, Reading out loud here is fairly straightforward.
Yeah.
You choose some English text, could be an online article, a book, song lyrics, and you simply speak it aloud, focusing on clear pronunciation.
Okay, similar to reading notes, but with external text.
Yes, but shadowing takes it a step further, and it's quite a powerful technique. With shadowing, you listen to a segment of spoken English audio or video, and you simultaneously attempt to repeat exactly what you hear, as you hear it, or immediately after.
Like being echo.
Exactly like being an echo. You try to mimic the speaker's pronunciation, their intonation patterns, the rise and fall of their voice, the rhythm of their speech, even their pauses, as closely as possible in real time or just slightly delayed.
Wow, okay. So with shadowing, it's like I'm literally trying to become a shadow of the speaker's voice, matching their delivery as precisely as I possibly can. That sounds challenging, but potentially very effective.
It is both. It can be challenging, especially at first, but it's incredibly effective for honing your pronunciation and developing a more natural-sounding rhythm and intonation in your own spoken English.
And the source specifically mentions that this technique, both reading aloud external texts and especially shadowing, has the significant added benefit of directly helping to improve pronunciation skills, right?
Absolutely. That's one of the primary benefits. By actively trying to replicate the sounds, the stress patterns, and the flow of native or proficient English speakers, you are directly training your mouth, your tongue, your vocal cords, and your ears to work together in better coordination to produce more accurate English pronunciation.
It helps you notice things you might otherwise miss just listening passively.
Definitely. It helps you develop a much better feel for the nuances of the language, those subtle shifts in intonation that convey meaning or emotion, the way words link together in natural speech, the overall musicality or rhythm of spoken English, things that are hard to learn just from rules.
The source uses the host's own videos as a practical example here, noting that the presence of on-screen text, like captions or subtitles, can be particularly helpful for both shadowing and reading aloud practice.
Yes, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Having the visual text available simultaneously can be incredibly beneficial, especially for learners who are maybe at an intermediate level or still developing their listening comprehension.
Why is the text so helpful?
Because it allows you to see the written words at the exact same time as you are hearing them spoken. This really reinforces the connection between the spelling of a word and its correct pronunciation. It provides a visual anchor for the sounds you are trying to reproduce, making the task a little less daunting, especially with faster speech or unfamiliar accents.
Okay, that makes sense. Text helps bridge the gap. So what are the recommended practical steps for actually implementing reading out loud and shadowing into a regular English learning routine? How do you actually do it?
Right, let's break down the practical steps. The first step is to carefully select a piece of content, a video or an audio file that you find genuinely interesting, that helps with motivation. And that is at a suitable level for you to follow reasonably well. Too difficult, and you'll get frustrated. Too easy, and you won't be challenged enough.
So find something engaging and at the right level. The source specifically suggested podcasts could be good for this.
Yes, podcasts were mentioned as an excellent resource for this kind of practice, mainly because they offer such a wide variety of topics, speaking styles, accents, and levels of formality, and they are purely audio-based, which forces you to rely on your listening skills. But videos with clear speakers are great too, especially if they have accurate captions.
Okay, so I could choose maybe a short clip from a podcast I enjoy listening to anyway, or perhaps a short educational video on a topic I like, maybe even a scene from a movie or TV show if I have the transcript. What's the next step in the actual practice process?
The next crucial step is to choose a specific, manageable time interval to work with for each repetition. Don't try to tackle too much at once.
Break it down.
Exactly. The source suggests starting with relatively short segments of the audio or video. Perhaps just 5 seconds or 10 seconds or maybe 15 seconds at a time, depending on your current comfort level, the speed of the speaker, and the complexity of the language being used.
So I don't try to shadow or read along with an entire 5-minute video all in one go, which would probably be overwhelming and ineffective. Instead, I break the content down into these smaller, more digestible chunks, 5, 10, 15 seconds.
Exactly. Short bursts are key. Then the process is this. You would play the audio or video for your chosen short interval, say 10 seconds, and then you immediately pause it.
Play.
Right. And during that pause, you then attempt to do one or both of the following. Either repeat exactly what you have just heard, mimicking the speaker as closely as possible.
Okay.
That's the shadowing part.
Mm-hmm.
And or, if there's accompanying text like captions, read that short segment of text aloud, again focusing on matching the pronunciation, rhythm, and intonation you just heard.
So play 10 seconds, pause, then immediately try to repeat it by ear, or read the corresponding text aloud mimicking the speaker, or maybe both. Then repeat with the next 10-second chunk.
Precisely. This start and stop method, this play, pause, repeat cycle, is absolutely crucial for making it an active learning process. It gives you the necessary time and focus you need to really listen carefully to the sounds, the intonation, the connections between words, and then to consciously try and replicate them accurately with your own voice.
So it's a really active, engaged, and quite intensive way of listening and speaking, isn't it? Much more effortful than just letting the audio play in the background while I'm doing something else.
Absolutely. It requires concentration. You're actively processing the input and then immediately attempting to reproduce it in these small focused segments. It's definitely more work than passive listening, but it's precisely this kind of focused repetition and active engagement that can lead to really significant improvements in both your pronunciation accuracy and your overall speaking fluency and rhythm over time.
It's like targeted practice for your mouth and ears.
Exactly. It trains your ear to recognize those subtle but important differences in English sounds and intonation patterns, and it trains your mouth to physically produce those sounds more effectively and naturally.
Okay, wow. These 5 solutions we've discussed, starting with the equal ratio to balance input and output, then the daily practice of learning and actively using one new word, followed by training our brains to think in English by summarizing our day, then activating our learning by taking notes and consistently reading them aloud, and finally honing pronunciation and fluency through reading external content aloud and shadowing. They all seem to share a very clear common thread, don't they?
They really do. What do you see as the main commonality?
Well, it seems to be the constant emphasis on active engagement with the English language and the need for consistent, deliberate practice involving actual speaking vocalization as the most effective ways to bridge that frustrating gap we talked about at the beginning, the gap between understanding English well and speaking it fluently.
That's a really insightful observation. I think you've nailed it. It really boils down to that fundamental principle. It's simply not enough to just passively absorb the language, however much you consume. To truly develop your speaking abilities, to make that knowledge truly your own and readily accessible, you need to actively produce the language yourself, consistently, in a variety of focused ways.
You have to do the language, not just receive it.
Exactly. Doing is learning, especially for a skill like speaking.
Now, moving slightly away from the pure techniques, the source material also includes a really relatable and quite human personal anecdote near the end. It's about the host speaker experiencing significant nervousness before giving a speech, even though they mentioned they don't typically consider themselves a particularly shy person. Can you share a little bit about that story and talk about how it might connect with the experiences of our listeners who are on their own, sometimes nerve-wracking journey of learning to speak English?
Yes, it's a very telling anecdote. It recounts an experience where the host was asked to prepare and deliver a sermon, a speech, at their church. Now, despite feeling well-prepared content-wise and generally not being someone who is typically afraid of public speaking.
Right, they clarified they weren't usually shy.
Exactly. Despite that, the host describes experiencing surprisingly significant physical nervousness on the actual morning of the event. They mentioned their stomach was churning, turning in knots, to the point where they actually felt quite physically unwell. It was this unexpected wave of anxiety that they hadn't really anticipated.
Wow. So even with careful preparation and a generally confident personality, that feeling of intense nervousness still managed to creep in quite strongly and unexpectedly.
It really did. And the anecdote mentions it wasn't until the host took a moment to pause and reflect on why they might be feeling these strong physical symptoms that they realized it was likely stemming from the perceived weight and importance of the message they were about to deliver. They felt a responsibility.
Ah, the pressure of the situation.
Yes. But despite feeling this intense nervousness, the host went through with giving the sermon. And importantly, the story concludes by saying it was ultimately very well received, with several people in the congregation coming up afterwards to express how much they had needed to hear those particular words that day.
That's a powerful outcome. So how does this story connect directly to our listeners who are learning English? What's the parallel?
The connection, I think, is really direct and reassuring. It shows that even though you, as a learner, might have a strong understanding of the English language, you've done the work, you know the vocabulary, you get the grammar, that feeling of nervousness, that apprehension about actually speaking, about potentially making mistakes, about not being able to find the perfect word instantly, about sounding foreign, that is a really, really common and entirely understandable experience.
It normalizes the nerves.
Exactly. The anecdote beautifully illustrates that even experienced communicators speaking in their native language about something they know well can still feel incredibly anxious when they're in a speaking situation that feels important, or perhaps where they feel judged or evaluated.
Right.
For English language learners, this nervousness can often be even more pronounced when you're operating in a non-native language. There's often that added pressure of worrying about potential grammatical errors, mispronunciation, searching for words, or simply feeling less articulate or less yourself than you do in your first language.
Yeah, that feeling of not being able to express your full personality.
Precisely. So the story serves as a powerful and hopefully reassuring reminder to listeners that these feelings of nervousness, of anxiety about speaking English are completely normal. You are absolutely not alone in experiencing them. It's part of the process for almost everyone.
And I think the really key takeaway from the anecdote, the most empowering part, is that despite feeling all that nervousness, the hosts still pushed through it. They didn't let the feeling stop them from delivering this sermon, and it ended up having a positive impact on others.
Exactly.
It reminds us, doesn't it, that we often have to acknowledge those feelings of anxiety, accept them perhaps, but then work through them and speak anyway, because we never truly know who might benefit from hearing what we have to say, even if our English doesn't feel absolutely perfect or polished to us.
That's such an important point. Just as the host's message, delivered through nerves, resonated with people in that congregation, your attempts to speak English, even if you feel self-conscious, even if you stumble, even if your language isn't perfect by some arbitrary standard, can still be incredibly valuable and meaningful.
You might connect with someone in a way you didn't expect.
You might. You could share an important idea, ask a crucial question, offer help, or simply gain more confidence yourself through the very act of trying to express yourself and communicate. Your words have value, even when you're learning.
The host also shares a really encouraging and I think quite empowering thought right at the end of that story too, don't they? Reminding listeners about their existing abilities.
Yes, they make a point of reminding listeners that the very fact that they can understand English as well as they already do, understanding conversations, videos, maybe even this deep dive right now, is already a significant achievement in itself. It's a testament to their intelligence, their dedication, and their inherent ability to learn and process complex language.
That's such a crucial and positive perspective to hold on to, isn't it? Your comprehension skills aren't just some passive secondary ability. They actually represent a strong and solid foundation upon which you can confidently build your speaking skills.
Absolutely. The very fact that you can understand English demonstrates significant cognitive ability and a clear capacity for language learning. Speaking is simply the next logical step, the activation step, in actively utilizing all that knowledge you've already worked so hard to acquire.
So the overall message from that anecdote seems to be, acknowledge the nerves, accept that they're a normal part of the language learning journey for many people, but please don't let that feeling become a permanent barrier that prevents you from practicing and actually speaking.
Exactly. Persistence and the willingness to sometimes step just a little bit outside your comfort zone are absolutely key, even perhaps especially when you feel a bit uncomfortable or unsure of yourself.
Because that's where the growth happens, right?
That's almost always where the real growth happens. Every single time you push through that initial hesitation or nervousness and choose to speak English anyway, you are not only building your fluency step by step, but you are also strengthening your confidence muscle and reinforcing your belief in your own ability to communicate effectively in the language. Each small act of speaking is a victory and a crucial step forward on your journey.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive, hasn't it? We've explored some incredibly practical, actionable strategies for genuinely improving your English speaking skills and bridging that gap. We've thoroughly explored the importance of creating that crucial balance between listening and speaking with the equal ratio principle.
The 50-50 split.
We've looked at the power of consistently building your active vocabulary by learning and, more importantly, actively using just one new word or phrase each day.
Making it stick through usage.
We've discussed the valuable practice of training your brain to think more directly in English by taking time to summarize your own day's events in the target language.
Connecting English to your life.
We've examined the way that taking useful notes and then regularly reading them aloud can reactivate and solidify your learning.
Turning passive notes into active practice.
And finally, we explored the benefits of honing your pronunciation, rhythm, and overall fluency through the techniques of reading external content aloud and the powerful practice of shadowing native speakers.
Mimicking the sounds and flow.
And alongside all these practical techniques, we've also touched on that very real, very human and universal feeling of nervousness that can often accompany language learning, and the critical importance of finding ways to manage it and not letting it hold you back from speaking.
These are all genuinely actionable techniques. They're not just abstract theories. They are concrete things that our listeners can begin to incorporate into their learning routines, perhaps starting as soon as today, and then hopefully start to see tangible, noticeable progress in their speaking abilities over time with consistent effort.
Definitely. We sincerely hope that these strategies, these ideas, and the insights we've shared during this deep dive today have been helpful, maybe encouraging, and ultimately empowering for you on your personal English language journey. But of course, knowing the strategies is only the first step, right?
Absolutely. The most important thing now is to take what you've learned, what resonated with you from this discussion, and actively put it into practice in your daily life. Find ways to integrate these ideas into your routine.
Remember, as we've said a few times, consistent effort, even if it's just in small increments each day, really does compound and can lead to significant and lasting progress in your speaking skills over time. Don't feel you have to do everything perfectly all at once.
That's great advice. We really encourage you to perhaps start by choosing just one or two of these techniques that feel most appealing or most relevant to your current situation. Focus on implementing those first. Then, as you get comfortable, you can gradually integrate the others into your routine as you feel ready. The most crucial step, really, is to simply start speaking English more, whenever and however you can find the opportunity.
Absolutely.
You know how social media is just everywhere now, part of our daily lives.
Absolutely inescapable, isn't it?
Totally. I mean, you think about Facebook, YouTube, WhatsApp, WeChat, Instagram, billions of users.
Billions. It's staggering.
And for young people, especially in, well, richer countries, it's like over 90% are using them. Spending, get this, an average of over 4 hours online. Every single day.
4 hours? Wow, that's a huge chunk of their waking life right there.
Exactly. Now, okay, it's great for staying connected, getting info, all that good
So
stuff.
there are definite upsides.
But then you hear so much concern about what it's doing to our well-being, our mental health.
Understandably so. That level of engagement, it naturally sparks questions about the impact. Is it good? Is it bad? It's complicated.
Right. So for this deep dive, you pulled together some really interesting research surveys, longitudinal studies, even experiments.
Yeah, real mix of approaches.
And our mission here isn't just, reacting to scary headlines. We want to dig into the science. What causally affects our well-being when it comes to social media?
Moving beyond just the correlations.
Exactly. For you, the learner, this is about getting that deeper understanding, the complexities, maybe some surprises, without feeling totally overwhelmed by jargon.
And that's a key distinction right away, isn't it? Correlation versus causation. A lot of the early stuff was survey-based. What did that initially tell us?
Well, those first surveys, they definitely set off some alarm bells.
Yeah.
They found people who use social media a lot also reported more anxiety, depression, sleep issues, stuff like that.
Okay, so a link was observed.
Yeah. And there was that girl guiding survey, over 1,000 girls and young women. A third of them said their biggest online worry was comparing their lives to others.
Wow, 1 in 3.
And how that comparison hit their well-being. It's a powerful idea, the constant comparing.
It really is. And, psychologically speaking, that need for approval, for seeing how we stack up against others, that's not new, is it?
No, it definitely predates social media.
Right. The Revist ABM piece touched on this, but social media just gives it this, global 247 stage, always accessible.
Yeah, that psychologist, Shana Vasconcellos, she mentioned that.
Oh.
And also this idea of edited lives online.
Yes, the highlight reel effect.
Exactly. What people post isn't the whole picture, right? It's the curated version. And she said that can make people feel lonely, inadequate, because their own real life, with all its bumps, doesn't match up.
That makes a lot of sense. You see these perfect moments, perfect bodies, perfect vacations. It's easy to forget the messy reality behind the screen. But like you said, those initial studies were mostly showing correlations and drawing causal lines from that. It's tricky.
Yeah, right, tricky.
The Our World in Data piece really drove this home, and that Nature paper by Orban and Przybylski showed how, depending on how you slice the data, you could find positive links, negative links, or, well, nothing significant at all.
Even with the same data.
Exactly, which really highlights the limitations of just looking at correlations.
Okay, so just because heavy users are also more anxious doesn't mean the social media caused the anxiety.
Precisely. It could be the other way around. Maybe people who are already struggling turn to social media more.
Right. For connection or maybe just distraction.
Could be any number of things. That's the big question. Correlational studies can't fully answer which way does the arrow point.
So that's where longitudinal studies come in, right? Following the same people over time.
Exactly. They let us see if changes in, say, Facebook use come before changes in well-being or vice versa. Gives you a more nuanced picture.
And some of those did seem to point towards a negative impact, like that 2017 study, Shakya and Christakis.
Yes, the American Journal of Epidemiology one. They followed over 5,000 Americans and found that, increases in Facebook activity seemed to predict a future decrease in self-reported mental health.
Okay, so that fueled the fire a bit.
It definitely did. It was one of the earlier prominent studies suggesting that kind of direction.
But then, wasn't there another big one in 2019 in PNAS? Orban, Danelan, and Przylski again? Looking at UK teens?
Yes, that one. A large group followed over a longer period. And their conclusion was a bit different, more nuanced.
How so?
They found a small reciprocal relationship. So, social media use predicted tiny dips in life satisfaction later on.
Okay.
But also, lower life satisfaction predicted slight increases in social media use later on. It went both ways.
So like a feedback loop, but a small one.
A very small one. That was the key takeaway reported in The Guardian. They called the effects minuscule by the standards of science and basically trivial for parenting decisions.
Trivial, really?
Yeah. They found only 0.4%, less than 0.5% of the difference in teen girls' life satisfaction could be linked to their social media use.
Wow. Okay, so for you, the learner, the big picture here is, yes, there's a link, but social media's impact on general teen happiness.
Yeah.
Probably a really small factor overall.
Exactly. It puts things into perspective. It's likely just one tiny piece of a huge puzzle affecting well-being.
And that highlights the difference between statistical significance, meaning it's probably not random chance, and practical significance, like how much does it actually matter in the real world?
Precisely. That 0.4% is statistically significant, probably real, but the effect size is tiny, like a drizzle, not a downpour.
Okay, so surveys show links, longitudinal studies show tiny, maybe two-way links over time, but for actual cause and effect, you need experiments.
That's the gold standard for causality, yes, where you actively change something for one group and compare them to a control group.
Like that 2019 NBER study, Alcott and colleagues, where they literally paid people to quit Facebook.
That's the one. A large group deactivated their accounts for 4 weeks, while a control group didn't.
And what happened to the quitters? Did they suddenly become blissfully happy?
Well, not exactly blissfully happy, but they did find small, there's that word again, small but statistically significant improvements in some well-being measures.
Like what?
Self-reported happiness, life satisfaction, loneliness, anxiety, depression. They all nudged slightly in a positive direction for the group that quit compared to the group that kept using Facebook.
Okay, so there is a causal effect there.
Yes, the experiment suggests a causal link.
But, and this seems important, the Our World in Data Analysis pointed out these causal effects were much smaller than the correlation suggested.
That's a crucial finding. The experimental evidence tones down the alarm bells quite a bit. It suggests simply using or not using Facebook might not have the huge impact on overall well-being that people feared based on those earlier correlations.
And that wasn't just a one-off finding, right?
No, the Our World in Data piece mentioned it was replicated in another similar experiment. Small positive effects from quitting seem consistent.
This is making me think, maybe it's less about just being on social media and more about what we're doing and seeing there, the content.
Exactly. The type of content, the context of our interactions, that likely matters a lot.
Like, did the Alcott study find something about news consumption when people quit Facebook?
It did. Quitting Facebook also led to people consuming less news overall.
Huh. And wasn't there that expert on CBS New York talking about information overload?
Yes, they mentioned how overwhelming the sheer volume of information can be and how hard it is to spot misinformation. Plus, algorithms feeding us stuff we already agree with.
Right, the filter bubble thing.
And connecting that back to the Alcott study. If quitting Facebook reduces news intake, and news tends to be quite negative.
I see. So maybe part of the well-being effect isn't Facebook itself, but the news people see on Facebook.
That's a strong possibility. Our World in Data noted that negative skew in news, and research shows exposure to negative news, can have actual physiological effects. Stress responses, things like that.
So it's not just mindless scrolling. It might be scrolling through stressful stuff.
Could be a big part of it. Which again tells us we can't just paint social media with one negative brush. It's complex. People use it for so many different things.
Which brings us to something more specific and definitely harmful: cyber victimization.
Yes, this shifts the focus from general well-being effects to direct, targeted negative experiences.
And that Canadian Health Survey on Children and Youth from 2019 really looked into this, didn't it?
It did. A valuable snapshot. They defined cyber victimization pretty broadly: threats, harassment, exclusion, sharing private info without consent, all done electronically to cause harm.
And the numbers were concerning.
Very. Almost 1 in 4 Canadian teens aged 12 to 17 had experienced some form of it in the past year.
1 in 4, that's a lot.
It is. And the survey found certain groups were even more vulnerable.
Who specifically?
Transgender and non-binary youth, girls attracted to other girls or unsure about their attraction, and teens with chronic health conditions, especially if they were female or from lower-income families. They faced higher risks.
And the link between being targeted like that and mental health.
Really strong and consistent. Experiencing cyber victimization was clearly associated with poorer general mental health, more depression and anxiety, eating disorder symptoms, thinking about suicide, and even attempting suicide.
That's incredibly serious.
Absolutely. And interestingly, while some groups were more likely to be targeted, the negative mental health impact seems similar for anyone who experienced it. The harm was consistent.
Did the survey connect this to how much time kids spent online?
Generally, yes. Lower frequency of digital media use tended to correlate with a lower chance of being cyber-victimized, which makes intuitive sense: less exposure, perhaps less opportunity.
And cyberbullying was a big theme in that Brazilian study too, the Panorama de Saúde Mental 2024.
It was. They found 27% of young Brazilians experienced it, which is right in line with the Canadian numbers. Significant chunks of young people are dealing with this.
And the effects they noted?
Pretty severe. A 35% increase in social withdrawal, difficulties interacting, which obviously hits mental health, behavior, school performance. The online anonymity factor, which the Revista ABM also mentioned, can unfortunately make these attacks easier or harsher.
This really drives home that point. The average effect of social media might be small, but for those who are targeted and victimized online, the impact is anything but small. It can be devastating.
Absolutely. And that leads into another layer. This pressure for perfection, the constant need for validation online.
Yeah, the Revista ABM article talked about that need for approval being amplified.
Exactly. This tendency, especially for younger people, to kind of use their bodies, their image, as currency for online approval, which means spending more time crafting that image. And that online space, while connecting, can also feel fragmenting, borderless, which can be risky for people who are already vulnerable psychologically.
And the Brazilian study linked heavy use directly to anxiety and depression rates, didn't it?
It did. Found 45% of anxiety cases in young Brazilians, 15 to 29, were linked to excessive social media use, and a 30% higher risk of depression for those spending over 3 hours a day on platforms.
Wow. And that idea of the display of perfect moments creating a distorted reality that really hits home.
It does. It sets up these unattainable standards. And the Brazilian study also found 40% said their self-esteem was directly affected by likes and comments.
40%. That's significant.
Especially for adolescents, right? When you're still figuring out who you are, that external validation, or lack thereof, can hit really hard. It becomes this cycle of seeking approval.
Definitely an unhealthy cycle.
Okay.
Another big thing that comes up is sleep. How does social media mess with our sleep?
Oh, big time. Several sources mention this. The light from our screens, especially the blue light, inhibits melatonin production.
Melatonin, the sleep hormone.
Exactly. So using devices close to bedtime makes it harder to fall asleep. Plus, the content itself is often interactive and stimulating, not relaxing.
And then there's the infinite feed, right? Just keeps you scrolling.
Keeps you scrolling, keeps you engaged. And even if you do fall asleep, notifications can wake you up.
Oh, yeah.
And we need sleep, right? Palava really emphasized this. It's crucial for learning, memory, emotional regulation. Lack of sleep leads to fatigue, mood swings, weight gain, depression risk, poor school or work performance. The list goes on.
It really affects everything.
Yeah.
And neurologically, there's something going on too with dopamine.
Yes, VitaSimples explain this well. Those notifications, the likes, the comments, they trigger a little dopamine release in the brain.
A reward chemical.
Precisely. It creates this reward loop, makes us want to check back, seek that immediate gratification. It keeps us hooked.
Like a little slot machine in our pocket.
Kind of, yeah. And VitaSimples also pointed out how these constant interruptions, pings, notifications, they shatter our focus, creates this low-level but continuous stress.
I feel that. Hard to concentrate sometimes.
And that lack of deep concentration over time might even contribute to long-term memory issues. Plus, they directly linked increased screen time to increased anxiety and stress levels.
Okay, so given all these potential pitfalls, the comparison, the cyberbullying risk, the sleep disruption, the dopamine loops, what can people actually do? What are the practical tips?
Thankfully, there's quite a bit of actionable advice. That CBS New York interview mentioned two key things: focus time and reflection.
Focus time, like putting the phone away.
Basically, yeah. Single tasking. Setting aside time for a specific task and eliminating those digital distractions. And reflection means actively thinking about how and why you use your phone. When do you reach for it? How long do you stay? How does it make you feel afterwards? Becoming more aware.
That makes sense. What else?
VitaSimples had similar ideas. Being mindful, asking yourself, what am I gaining versus losing with this screen time? Using phone features like focus mode, and maybe not quitting cold turkey, but gradually reducing usage.
Small steps.
Exactly. Unimed Campinas suggested curating your feed, actively choosing to follow accounts that make you feel good, unfollowing those that don't.
Taking control of the algorithm in a way.
Sort of, yeah. And turning off non-essential notifications that cuts down the constant urge to check. Setting specific goals for usage time can also help.
And wasn't there something about just 30 minutes a day?
Yeah, Medical News Today mentioned a study suggesting that limiting use to around 30 minutes a day could potentially reduce FOMO, fear of missing out, and the anxiety and depression linked to it.
So the common thread seems to be intentionality, being mindful, making conscious choices.
Absolutely. Moving from just passively consuming whatever the feed throws at you to actively shaping your online experience.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, it feels like the big takeaway is complexity. The relationship between social media and well-being isn't simple.
Not at all. It's definitely a two-way street, it seems. The direct causal effects on overall well-being for the average person are probably quite small. Smaller than the scary headlines often suggest.
Right. And this is a big but.
A very big but. In specific harmful situations like cyber victimization, or for people who are already vulnerable, the negative impact can be really significant, really damaging.
And the type of content matters. What we see, how we interact.
Yeah.
That plays a huge role.
And excessive use does seem linked to real problems: anxiety, depression, definitely poor sleep, body image issues, that reliance on external validation.
So for you, the learner, the message isn't necessarily social media is evil, throw your phone away.
No, the evidence doesn't really support that sweeping claim.
But it is saying we need to be thoughtful. We need to be aware of how these platforms are designed and how they affect us personally.
Precisely. Which leads to maybe a final thought to chew on.
Yeah.
How can you personally start actively shaping your own online world? Make it a place that supports your well-being, fosters connection, rather than just comparison and anxiety. Based on everything we've talked about, what small changes could you maybe try today? Thinking about your habits, the content you consume, how could you make it work better for you?